Okay, thank you for your time today. I'm going to be doing a webinar today on travel expenses, travel diaries and substantiation, which for business owners is really important and crucial to maximising your claim on travel. Travel allowance in general is a payment made to an employee to cover their expenses on accommodation, food, drink, and incidental things that they incur while they are away travelling from home overnight in the course of their duties. Now, what a travel diary does, and I'm going to go through allowances and diaries and substantiation in more detail in a minute. But what this is it shows you just the summary of stuff, and I'm going to go into more detail shortly. A travel diary shows dates, places, times, what you did, how long they lasted, and why you were traveling. And the purpose really of a travel diary is to help you split the work-related and deductible bits from the private and non-deductible bits of travel. Clearly, you can only claim business travel portion, so deductible bits, and private travel is not claimable. With substantiation, there's a couple of different methods of substantiating your travel claims, and I want to cover those off today so that after the end of today's webinar, you'll understand the different options available to you as a business owner and as a business owner where you're also an employee, and you can decide which is the best option for you to maximise your claims. And you know the substantiation side of it too, and therefore the ATO, if they audit, you'd be ticking the box on that. Okay, I'm going to, in a few slides time, I'm going to cover a bona fide, what a bona fide travel allowance is. I'm going to cover that in a minute. But just for all intensive purposes, if a bona fide travel allowance is not paid, okay, the emphasis is not paid, I'm going to cover it in two: domestics, and I'm going to cover Australian travel, and I'm going to cover overseas travel. So under Australian travel, if you don't get a travel allowance and you travel within Australia, okay, if you travel for less than 6 nights in a row, so in other words, if you travel from 1 night to 5 nights, in other words, less than 6 in a row, you need to get written evidence. So what that means is tax invoices. So tax invoices to substantiate your travel expenses, but you do not need to keep a travel diary, okay? Now, if you travel for 6 or more, so the first one is 1 to 5, and the second one is 6 or more. If you travel for 6 or more nights in a row in Australia, once again, you need to keep written evidence, so tax invoices, and a travel diary is required. Now, I'm going to go through a travel diary in a minute for domestic and for international. So that's domestic. If you travel overseas, okay, and you travel for 1 to 5 nights, so less than 6 in a row, you need to keep written evidence, tax invoices, and under overseas, you still don't need to keep a travel diary. But if you travel for 6 or more nights in a row, you need to keep your written evidence again. And yes, you do need to keep a travel diary. Okay, so that's a nice summary table you can go to, and I've just explained what that all means. Where a bona fide travel allowance is paid. So the first slide was where a bona fide travel allowance isn't paid. This slide is where the bona fide travel allowance is paid. And I'll explain the difference. So this is into 2 distinct sections. Section 1 is where the amount claimed does not exceed the reasonable allowance amount. Remember, I'm going to cover that in a minute. So the first one is where the amount claimed does not exceed the reasonable allowance amount. So if you travel in Australia and the amount claimed does not exceed the reasonable allowance amount, and you travel for less than 6 nights, so from 1 to 5 nights, no, you don't need written evidence, and no, you don't need a travel diary. And in Australia, if the amount claimed does not exceed the reasonable allowance amount and you travel for 6 or more nights in a row, You still don't need written evidence and you still don't need a travel diary. Okay? Overseas. So where the amount claimed does not exceed the reasonable allowance and you're overseas and you travel for less than 6 nights, yes, you need written evidence, tax invoices, but no, you don't need a travel diary. But where you travel overseas and the amount claimed does not exceed the allowance amount and you travel for 6 or more nights in a row, you need your tax invoices for written evidence and you do need a travel diary. Where the amount claimed does exceed the reasonable allowance amount, because this isn't going to happen very often because of the way it's substantiated, you're probably not going to do option 2 very often because it's not tax effective in terms of substantiation and etc. So I'll go through it really quickly, but we probably won't use it much. So I wanted to focus on part 1. But part 2, in Australia, where you travel for less than 6 nights, yes, you need written evidence for the whole lot and no travel diary. And when you travel for more than 6 nights, 6 or more nights, yes, you need written evidence and yes, you need a travel diary. But when you're going overseas and you travel for less than 6 nights and you do pay above the allowance, you need written evidence and no travel diary for overseas. But where you travel for 6 or more nights and overseas, you need written evidence and a travel diary. I know it's a bit complicated, but this is a really nice summary for you to work with. And as I said, option 1 is going to be the one you really focus on, not option 2 if you're paying an allowance. Remember, you've got 2 choices. A bona fide travel allowance is option 1, and a travel allowance part 1 is option 2. Part 2 probably won't work. Now, when you come to deciding which is better out of a travel allowance being paid and the substantiation requirements and the travel allowance, and the travel allowance not being paid and the substantiation requirements and the travel allowance being paid and the substantiation requirements, I strongly suggest that we have a conversation between you and us so we can talk through the scenario, talk through the substantiation, talk through which is the best method for you and your situation, because everyone's situation is going to be very different. How to keep a travel diary. You need to record in your travel diary, and I'm going to go through a specific example in a minute, your movements and activities whilst you're away. So where you are, what you're doing, when you started it, when you ended it, etc. And it needs to be in English, which is stating the obvious. Here's an example of our travel diary template. Now, let me talk you through this. Name, that would obviously be you. So Adrian Hill. Date commence trip. Well, let's say I started my trip on the 1st of April 2018. You sign it. Date you ended. I was away for 2 weeks, so the 15th of April 18. Reason for the trip. I attended a conference in Brisbane or LA or wherever, right? Now, nature of business activity down below. This is where you fill in what you've done for your business trip. So if you're at a conference, you'd be filling in the days, you'd be filling in what you're doing, what date you're doing it, where you're doing it, start time, end time, and how long it lasted. And you do that for every item in here that is a business-related activity whilst you're away. And this is where consultation with us before you travel is probably a good thing, because we can talk to you about what you're doing overseas or in Australia, what's the nature of your trip, what things you need to be aware of so you can properly and completely complete this, accurately complete this travel diary. Because the idea behind it is, like with a car logbook, in here you're filling in all your business-related time and activities that you're doing whilst you're away, whether it be overseas or in Australia. And you're putting all the details here, the dates, where you've done it, start, end times, and how long. And everyone's going to be totally different. But the idea being, you add up things here, number of days spent in transit, number of days where business undertaken, number of days private, total number of days, and then you divide that out and you'll get the business percentage. And the idea being A plus B divided by C will give you your business-related percentage of the trip. Now, just a little side note on that. The tax office take a pretty dim view on travel, whether that be international or Australian, especially international, because airfares are far more expensive. Travelling overseas is obviously way more expensive than travelling in Australia. So, for instance, if you were going to a conference in Brisbane or Surface, or going to a conference in Las Vegas or LA or whatever, and the conference lasts a week, and then you have a 2-week holiday on top, and so you're away for 3 weeks. Yes, you can fill in your diary here to get your 1/3 business use potentially on that trip example I've just given. But the problem you're going to find is where the predominant purpose of a trip is private. And in my example, 2 weeks out of 3 is private. That's predominantly private. They will not allow any of the airfare, none, nada, nil. So what they will allow is your 1 week's worth of down here, if that's all it was, accommodation, meals, and other bits and incidental costs associated with that 1 week. And the rest of the 2 weeks, your 2 weeks private accommodation, your 2 weeks travel costs, your airfare in total, that would not be allowed in any way, shape or form. So just be mindful of that if you think you're going to be able to claim a certain amount, that if the predominant purpose of your trip is private, you will get 0 of your airfare. It used to be apportioned years ago to business usage, but now the ATO take a dim view on that, and they basically say, no, you're only able to get your business percentage. Sorry, start again. Yeah, if your predominant purpose of the trip is private, you will not get a cent of your airfare claim, and the rest of it's prorated. So I really encourage each of you to talk to us before you travel, before you book your travel. So in other words, what I really want you to do is before you pay for anything, before you book anything, before you do anything relating to a trip, especially overseas, but even in Australia as well, talk to us about what you're doing, why you're doing it. Talk to us about the travel diary and how to complete that accurately, and that it's completed in a way that would measure up as being representative of your trip, as well as being the ATO happy with it in the event of an audit. Now, this is from the ATO website. So that one there was our sample travel diary that you could use in Australia or overseas, right, which has what you need. This is an example off the Australian taxation website, an example travel diary for Australian travel. Now, I'm not going to go through it all there, but you can see it's got the days listed, it's got the times, it's got what you've done, how long you've done it for, etc., etc. So you would be able to use, the stuff in our diary would also be in here. Like if you translated that onto our diary, that would easily fit. This is just a different way of looking at the same information that we had on that one. They're put in that format. On the next page is an example travel diary for overseas. And they give examples there where, for instance, on the 9th, flight comes in, train, rest, international teachers convention, sightseeing, holiday, etc., right? And then trip home. That's the sort of stuff which, once again, you could translate that all into here as well, if you know what I mean. Like it would all be doable. But that's examples that they gave from the tax office website, which will again help you complete your diary. Now, I said I was going to come to travel allowances. Okay. TD 2018/11 is also known as the reasonable travel and a meal allowance expense amounts for the 2018-19 tax year. The ruling is pages and pages long. I've just taken an excerpt out of it to give you an example. So, for example, someone who's on a salary of between 122,041 and 217,200, how it works with the allowance is, let's say you're traveling to Adelaide, okay? In Adelaide, on that salary, they give you a $208 accommodation allowance. They give you meals and incidentals of the $30 plus $42.45 plus $59.40, and then incidentals of $28.20. Now, if you add all that up, that that there, 208, plus all of those, plus that adds up to 368.05. So what can happen is, and this is another way of substantiating travel, is your employer could, in theory, pay you, if you're in Adelaide for 2 days at a conference or with seeing clients or whatever, right? They could pay you, in theory, a daily allowance of $368.05. Now, how that's treated in the books of your employer is this amount here is treated in the profit and loss. It would be shown as a travel allowance, right? So in the travel, say you just had 1 day, just to keep it simple, there'd be a $368.05 your employer would pay you as an employee, okay? And in the employer's books, it would be shown as travel allowance $368.05, which they claim as a tax deduction. In your side of things, that $368.05 is not income to you. It's not part of your salary. It's just a travel allowance you've been paid, but nor can you claim anything unless, as an employee, and we're coming back to this, where the amount, if you're trying to claim more than the reasonable allowance amount, you've got to remember you've got to meet all these things. And if you're not trying to claim more than the reasonable allowance amount, these are the substantiation requirements. So no written evidence, yes and no, yes and yes, okay? So it's really a numbers game, because it comes back to which is the most cost-effective way of substantiating travel. Is it paying an allowance to an employee, okay, to travel overnight at $368.05, which is deductible, and the substantiation requirements are quite low, because if you remember, if you go back up here, if there's no claim more than that, you really don't need, no one really needs to keep receipts, right? But if the actual cost, as per up here, is going to be higher than this, than doing the reasonable travel allowance, then you've got to seriously consider whether travel allowance is the right method or actual is the method. And under either scenario, it's really just a number crunching exercise to work out which is the most effective way to claim your travel. Because under this scenario, just to revisit it, under this scenario here, you need to keep tax invoices in all cases, and in some cases you need a travel diary. And down here, in section 1, right, remember we're not focusing on section 2, in section 1 there's tax invoices, unless you travel overseas, are not required, and travel diary requirements are only quite limited. So it really comes back to here, which is the most effective. So you've got to look at it from two angles. Tax deduction wise, which is going to give me the best claim and most effective claim for my business. And 2, for substantiation point of view, which is the best way to do it for substantiation, and then work out the best combo, because clearly you can't have your cake and eat it. If you go one method, that means that includes whatever substantiation that comes with. If you go the other method, that means that includes whatever substantiation that comes with. But what it's really about is to be able to give you the tools to make an informed decision about travel and maximising your travel claims and how you structure your travel for yourself and your employees, and work out which way you want to do it, which is the most effective and efficient, and more importantly, maximises the tax deductions for your business. And we are more than happy, and we certainly very much encourage you guys having a chat with us before you book anything, before you pay anything, and definitely, even more importantly, before you go away, so you know the ramifications. But I think you really need to have these discussions before you book and pay for anything, because I think you need to know the ramifications of all the travel and travel diaries and substantiation before you book and pay for things. So you've got your head around it and you know which way you're playing the game once you've booked and paid it, then you know what you need to do to maximise your claim. But sometimes if you knew some information, you might have structured your trip differently, you might have done the order differently, etc., etc. E.g., case in point, that example, if the predominant purpose of the trip is private and you can't claim the airfare, That might have changed things drastically for you with doing it at all, or how you do it, or what you're doing while you're away, how you structure your trip, how you plan for it, etc. And I can't encourage enough that a lot of people spend a lot of money on travel and business travel, and they really need to get their head around this. And more, as I said, more than happily have a discussion. I encourage having a discussion with us before you do anything, so we can help you sort through the methods and methodologies and principles here and make sure you get the best bang for your buck on your travel. So thank you very much for your attention and time today. I really appreciate it. And I hope now, at least at the end of this webinar, that you've got a much greater understanding of travel diaries, substantiation, and the sorts of things you need to be looking at before and during your travel, and that you now have the tools necessary to maximise your claims in that space. And I certainly encourage each of you to talk to us about your own situation and how we can help you maximise your travel expenses moving forward. Thank you very much for your time, and until I speak again, chat to you guys again, look after yourselves, and goodbye.